I'm Brooklyn Carr. I'm 23 years old and I have a 4-month-old baby. I never thought I'd be a single mother at this age, but here I am, sitting in my cousin's flat, trying to figure out what's next. This wasn't the plan. I wanted to go back home after my breakup, back to my parents' house, where I thought I'd feel safe. But they didn't have room for me, not with my baby. They didn't say it, but I knew what they meant. I pretended it was okay, told them I'd figure it out, and I guess I did. Kendrick, my cousin, offered to let me stay with him. He's 23 too and has his own place. A 2-bedroom flat on the ground floor. It's not big, but it'll do for now. I didn't have many other options, so I packed my things and moved in. I was lucky. He didn't make it weird or uncomfortable. He just told me I could stay as long as I needed. And he's good with my baby, which helps more than I'd like to admit. But the truth? I feel like I'm walking around with a secret I can't escape because Kendrick isn't just my cousin. 4 years ago, we went on a family holiday to France. That trip changed everything. I remember arriving at the hotel, unpacking and heading out to see the sights. It was beautiful. Narrow streets, colourful markets and little cafes tucked away on corners. I should have been concentrating on all that, but instead I kept noticing the way the girls looked at Kendrick. He'd always been good-looking and I hated how much I noticed it. It was worse to see how other girls noticed it too. They wore tiny shorts and tank tops, giggled and flipped their hair, hoping he'd look their way. And sometimes he did. I hated it. I hated the way it made me feel invisible. I don't think I realized what I was doing at first. I started dressing differently, short skirts, low-cut tops. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I just wanted to feel confident. But deep down I wanted him to look at me the way he looked at her. And when he didn't, it just made me try harder. One night, it all came to a head. We were in the hotel bar. I'd had a few drinks, probably too many. I saw these 2 older women talking to him, touching his arm, laughing too loudly. I felt something snap. Some guy at the bar was buying me drinks, but I couldn't concentrate on him. All I could think about was Kendrick. So I went over and pulled him away from those women. I don't even remember exactly what I said, just that I was mad that he wasn't paying attention to me. He said I looked good. That's all it took. One compliment, and suddenly everything changed. After that, things happened quickly. We went back to my room. I got into my pajamas, and before I could think too much, he was kissing me. I didn't stop him. I didn't even try. We slept together. Twice. When the trip was over, we pretended nothing had happened. Back home, there were moments. At family parties, at his house when no one else was around, when it felt like it could happen again. But it didn't. I buried it. I moved on. I dated other people. And now I have a baby with a man who walked away the minute things got hard. And somehow I'm back here, in Kendrick's flat, sleeping in his spare room, pretending everything's fine. But it's not. I still feel it, the tension between us, and it scares me. I keep telling myself it's temporary, that I'll just get back on my feet, save some money and move out. But every time I catch him looking at me or seeing him holding my baby, I wonder if I'm lying to myself. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to this channel if you like the story so far. It helps more than you know, and there's more to come. So let's get back to it. The summer I turned 19, my family decided to take a 2-week trip to France. It was going to be one of those perfect holidays. City tours, beaches, and endless sightseeing. I didn't expect it to change my life the way it did. I remember stepping off the plane, already exhausted, and seeing Kendrick waiting at the baggage claim. He looked different, older, more confident. His hair was shorter than before, and he had filled out in ways I hadn't noticed until then. Girls noticed too. It started almost immediately in the hotel lobby. A group of girls in short skirts kept looking in his direction. On the street, women stared at us as we passed. I don't know why it bothered me so much. I told myself it was just protective cousin stuff, but it wasn't. I hated how much attention he was getting, and I hated how invisible it made me feel. By the 3rd day, I was tired of pretending it didn't bother me. I started dressing differently, skirts instead of jeans, tops that were lower than usual. I didn't even recognize myself in the mirror, but I liked the way people's heads turned when I walked by, and Kendrick noticed. Not right away, but enough. We were in a museum, and I caught him looking. I wasn't even trying to get his attention at the time. I was just leaning over a glass case. But when I looked up, his eyes were on me. He looked away too quickly, and something about that made me feel powerful. Things changed that night in the hotel bar. I'd had a few drinks, enough to make me feel warm and a little reckless. Kendrick was sitting at the bar, surrounded by two older women who couldn't stop touching his arm and laughing too loudly. They were practically draped over him. I told myself I didn't care, but my stomach was on fire. Some guy had bought me a drink, but I didn't even know his name. I just kept looking at Kendrick, waiting for him to look in my direction. He didn't. I couldn't take it anymore. I went over and pulled Kendrick aside and told him I was pissed. I didn't even make sense. I just blurted out that he wasn't paying attention to me. He laughed at first, but then he got serious. He told me I looked good, that I'd been turning heads all night. I don't know what it was about hearing him say that, but it made my skin tingle. Before I could answer, the guy who'd been buying me drinks came over. He grabbed my arm and tried to drag me back to the bar. Kendrick didn't even hesitate. He stepped between us and told the guy to back off. The guy pushed Kendrick, and for a second I thought it was going to get worse. But Kendrick stood his ground, and eventually the guy backed off. I don't know what came over me after that. Maybe it was relief, or maybe it was the way Kendrick looked at me when it was just the two of us again. We went back to my room. I got into my pajamas, and before I could even think about what I was doing, Kendrick was kissing me. I didn't stop him. It was slow at first, as if we were both waiting for the other to pull away. But neither did. It didn't feel wrong in the moment. It felt inevitable. We slept together. Twice. We didn't talk about it the next morning. We went back to being cousins, back to sightseeing, back to pretending nothing had happened. But the air between us was different after that. Every look felt heavier. Every touch lasted a little longer than it should have. And then we went home, and the secret stayed between us. Going home after that trip felt like coming back to reality, but nothing about it felt real. Kendrick and I didn't talk about what had happened in France. We didn't make any promises. We didn't even say it was a mistake. We just pretended it hadn't happened. But it lingered. The first family gathering after the trip was the hardest. I remember walking into my aunt's house and seeing Kendrick across the room. He was laughing with his brother, completely at ease, as if he hadn't been in my bed just weeks before. I kept telling myself to act normal, but my eyes wouldn't stop wandering to him. Every time he moved, I noticed it. Every time he looked in my direction, I felt it. Then it started. Little things. He'd catch my eye from across the table and smile like we shared a secret, or he'd walk past me and brush my arm just enough to make my skin burn. At one point, he leaned in and whispered something about how different I looked, how grown up. I laughed it off, but inside I couldn't breathe. The worst part, no one noticed. No one asked why we seemed closer, or why I couldn't look him in the eye for too long. And that made it worse. Not long after that, I started dating. It wasn't serious, just a way of distracting myself. I told myself I was moving on, that Kendrick was my cousin, and that what had happened was just a mistake. Sometimes I even believed it. But then there'd be another family party, and he'd find a way to get me alone. Once I was in the kitchen helping to prepare food, everyone else was outside, and Kendrick came in behind me. He stood too close and I could feel the heat from his body. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded, but my hands were shaking. Then he reached past me for a plate, brushing against my back as if it was an accident. It wasn't. I didn't stop him. That's what kept me up at night, the fact that I'd let it happen, that even though we never crossed the line again, I'd let myself be drawn back to those moments when it felt like we might. But we didn't. And eventually, I told myself it didn't matter. I met someone, fell in love, or so I thought, and when I found out I was pregnant, I thought that was it. That I was starting over and Kendrick would just be a part of my past. But even then, he didn't disappear completely. When I told him I was pregnant, he congratulated me, but his eyes said something else. I didn't ask what it was. And now, after everything, here I am, back in his flat. It's been 4 years, but it doesn't feel that long. Some days it feels like no time has passed at all. Moving in with Kendrick felt like stepping into a storm I wasn't ready for. The first night, I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed in his spare room and rocked my baby to sleep. I tried to pretend I wasn't hyper-aware of Kendrick in the next room, his voice coming faintly through the wall as he talked to someone on the phone, his steps slow and heavy from the limp he hadn't quite recovered from. I told myself it was temporary, a few months, maybe less, just enough time to get a job and save up for my own place. That's what I told him, and he didn't argue. He just handed me the key and said, "Stay as long as you need to." But being here brought it all back. I didn't expect him to be so good with my daughter. The first time he picked her up, she curled up against him like she'd known him forever. He made a joke about her liking him more than me, and I laughed, but it hit me harder than I wanted to admit. He made it easy, too easy. He helped with feeding when I needed a break, folded laundry without being asked, and always seemed to know when I was about to break down. One night, after a long day of job hunting and rejection emails, I walked into the living room to find him on the couch with my baby asleep on his chest. The TV was on, but he wasn't watching it. He was just staring at her, his fingers lightly stroking her tiny hand. I froze for a second. I let myself imagine it, the three of us as a family, and then I hated myself for thinking it because Kendrick wasn't hers and he wasn't mine. The guilt ate at me, but it didn't stop the thoughts. Every time he touched my shoulder or walked past me in the kitchen, it felt like my skin was on fire. And the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was remembering too, made it even harder. I kept telling myself he wasn't the same Kendrick I'd met in France. He wasn't the confident, carefree guy who made me feel like the only girl in the room. He'd been through a lot. The car accident had happened a year before I moved in. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head on. Kendrick broke his tibia and hip and had a concussion that messed him up for months. He still walked with a limp, and some days the pain slowed him down so much that I could see the frustration in his eyes. But he never let it show for long. He'd joke about it, laugh at the limp, and insist he didn't need any help, even when it was clear he did. I think that's what scared me the most. Seeing him vulnerable made it harder to keep my guard up. I came home one afternoon to find him on the sofa, trying unsuccessfully to lift a box of baby equipment I'd ordered. "Let me help," I said, reaching for it. "I've got it," he grumbled, wincing as he shifted his weight. I crossed my arms. "Kendrick," he sighed, finally letting go of the box. "Fine, but don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to protect." I smiled, but it felt too easy, too natural. Later that night, after my baby had fallen asleep, I found myself sitting next to him on the couch. Neither of us said anything at first, and then he looked at me. "You're doing good, you know," he said quietly. "With her, with everything." I wanted to believe him, but the way he said it, the way he looked at me when he said it, made my chest tighten. I don't know if it was the exhaustion or the way his voice softened when he talked about my daughter, but at that moment it felt like the walls I'd built around me were crumbling. And that scared me more than anything. The tension started to creep back in before I even noticed it. At first it was subtle, little things. Kendrick would brush past me in the corridor, his hand barely brushing my lower back, and I'd feel it long after he'd gone. Or he'd hold my baby and look up at me with this softness in his eyes that made my stomach turn. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. But then came the comments. "You're amazing with her," he said one night as he watched me rock my baby to sleep. "Seriously, I don't know how you do it." His voice was low, almost as if he didn't want me to hear it. I froze for a second before forcing a smile. "You get used to it," but he didn't drop it. "No, I mean it," he said. "You're stronger than you think." I wanted to brush it off, but I couldn't. His words stayed with me, circling in my head long after he left the room. And then it started again, the jealousy. Kendrick wasn't exactly subtle when it came to women. He'd get texts late at night, and sometimes I'd catch him smiling at his phone. I hated how much it bothered me, especially when I had no right to feel that way. The first time I saw him leave the apartment dressed up, it hit me harder than I expected. I tried to play it cool, asking where he was going without making it obvious that I cared. "Getting drinks," he said, pulling on his jacket. "I won't be late." I nodded and smiled, pretending not to notice the way he adjusted his collar in the mirror. But the moment the door closed behind him, I felt sick. I spent the next 2 hours pacing the apartment, checking my phone, trying to convince myself that it didn't matter. But it did. When he came back, his shirt was a bit rumpled, and his hair looked like someone had run their fingers through it. He didn't say much, just gave me a tired smile and asked if the baby had been all right. I wanted to ask him about the girl. Instead, I said goodnight and went to my room. But sleep wasn't easy that night. The tension continued after that. It was in the way he looked at me, the way he touched me without thinking, straightening a strand of hair that had fallen in my face, or brushing his hand against mine when he handed me something. Once he caught me staring at him. He didn't say anything, but his lips curved into a small smile before he looked away. And that's when I knew it wasn't all in my head. It was real. The lines were blurring, and I didn't know how to stop it. I kept reminding myself that Kendrick was family, that we'd already crossed a line we shouldn't have, and it almost broke me the first time. But then he looked at me like I was the only one in the room, and all the arguments I'd rehearsed in my head disappeared. I wanted him, and that scared me more than anything. It happened on a night when everything was already too heavy. The baby had been crying for hours, and nothing I did seemed to help. I walked up and down the apartment, bouncing her in my arms until my back hurt, and my legs felt like they were going to give out. When Kendrick came home, my eyes were swollen from crying, and I didn't care that I looked a mess. He took one look at me, didn't say a word, and reached for the baby. "She probably just needs a change," he said, calm as ever, as if my whole world wasn't falling apart. I handed her to him without arguing and sank onto the couch. I didn't realize I was crying again until Kendrick sat down beside me, my daughter already asleep in his arms. "She's all right now," he said quietly. But I wasn't. I was broken. I didn't even know where to begin. Words poured out of me about my ex, how he'd walked away when things got hard, how I felt like I wasn't enough, like I'd already failed as a mother. Kendrick listened without interruption. He just sat there holding my baby like it was the easiest thing in the world. When I finally stopped talking, he didn't try to fix it. He didn't tell me it would be all right or that I was thinking too much. Instead, he said, "You don't deserve any of this." I looked at him, and the way he said it, the softness in his voice, made my throat tighten. He put the baby down in the cot and turned back to me. "You're not alone, Brooklyn." I wanted to believe him. And then it happened. It wasn't planned. One second we were sitting there, and the next his hand was on my cheek, wiping away a tear I hadn't even realized had fallen. I should have pulled away. I didn't. When he kissed me, I let him. It wasn't soft or hesitant. It was desperate, as if neither of us could stop, even if we wanted to. For a moment it didn't feel wrong, but then it hit me. I pulled back, my breathing uneven, my heart pounding. "This is wrong," I whispered. Kendrick didn't move. "I know," he said, but his voice sounded strained, like he didn't believe it any more than I did. He reached for my hand, and I didn't stop him. I wanted to. I told myself I would. But as his fingers laced through mine, it felt too familiar, too safe to let go. And just like that, the walls I'd spent years building came crashing down. We didn't talk after that, not about what it meant or what we should do now. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. His hands, his mouth, the way he looked at me when it was over. And the worst part, I wanted more. Even as the guilt sank in and twisted my stomach into knots, I wanted more. I woke up the next morning with a sinking feeling in my chest. Kendrick wasn't in the flat. The baby was still asleep, but the room felt heavy, like it couldn't hold what had happened the night before. My lips still tingled, my skin still burned where his hands had been, but my stomach was churning. What the hell had I done? I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking. I replayed it over and over, the kiss, the way we couldn't stop, the way I didn't want to stop. I told myself it was just the heat of the moment. I was emotional, vulnerable. He comforted me and it got out of hand. That's all it was, wasn't it? But deep down, I knew better. When Kendrick came home later that morning, the tension was palpable. He said, "Hey," like any other day, but I saw it in his eyes. He was nervous. I pretended to be busy folding baby clothes, my head down. "Morning, did she sleep well?" "Yeah." Neither of us mentioned what had happened. The next few days were a blur. I threw myself into the baby, feeding, cleaning, rocking her to sleep, anything to avoid Kendrick. He gave me space, but it didn't help. It made it worse because every time we crossed paths, whether it was passing each other in the hallway or sitting across the living room, it was there. The tension, the guilt, the desire. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and that scared me more than anything. I thought about leaving, packing up and going somewhere else. But my parents' house was still out of the question, and I hadn't saved up enough money for a place of my own. And then there was the baby. She needed stability. She needed me to hold her together. So I stayed. But staying meant looking after Kendrick, trying to act normal, even though I could tell he was struggling too. It also meant meeting his girlfriend. Her name was Liana Rubio. She wasn't his girlfriend, not officially, but it was clear she wanted to be. She came over one night, all long legs and perfect hair, carrying takeaway food and laughing at every joke Kendrick made. I hated her immediately. I hated the way she leaned into him, the way he let her. But most of all, I hated how much it bothered me. She was nice, too nice. She asked about the baby, offered to help, complimented my outfit. But all the time her eyes were darting back and forth between me and Kendrick, like she was trying to figure something out. I knew she saw it, the way Kendrick tensed when I walked into the room, the way he avoided looking at me when she was around. Later that night, after she had left, Kendrick knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" I shook my head. "Not tonight." He hesitated, then nodded and left. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. Instead, I sat in the dark, staring at my baby and wondering how I had let things get so bad. It all came crashing down faster than I thought. Liana turned up unannounced one afternoon, all smiles and sweetness, but her eyes told a different story. Kendrick wasn't home, just me and the baby. She was standing in the doorway holding a plastic bag full of baby clothes. "I saw them and thought of you," she said, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite her in. I forced a smile and took the bag. "That's really thoughtful." "Of course," she said, her eyes scanning the flat. "I just wanted to check in, make sure you're okay." The way she said it made my stomach turn. "I'm fine." She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "You and Kendrick seem close." I froze. "What does that mean?" She tilted her head, her smile sharp now. "I'm not stupid, Brooklyn." I opened my mouth to defend myself, but nothing came out. "Look, I don't know what's going on between you two, but whatever it is, it's not fair. Not to me, not to your baby." The words hit me like a slap. I wanted to shout at her, to tell her that she didn't know anything about me or my life, but the truth was heavy in my chest. Because she wasn't wrong. She came closer. "You have to figure out what you want, but if you think I'm just going to sit back and let you ruin Kendrick's life, you're wrong." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. When she left, the apartment felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. I spent the rest of the day avoiding Kendrick. But when the baby fell asleep, I knew I couldn't keep running away. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," I said. He nodded and put the phone down. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then it all came out. I told him everything. How I couldn't stop thinking about France, how being here with him made it impossible to move on, how I hated myself for wanting him even though I knew it was wrong. When I finished, my hands were shaking. Kendrick didn't look away. "I feel it too," he said softly. Those 4 words knocked the air out of me. "But I don't know what to do," he admitted. "You're my cousin, Brooklyn. We shouldn't feel this way." I sat down next to him, my heart pounding. "So what now?" He shook his head and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know." We sat in silence, the weight of it all pressing down on us. "I can't lose you," I finally said. "You won't," he said, but his voice was strained. I wanted to believe him, but the truth was there was no easy answer. We could keep pretending it hadn't happened, but that wouldn't make it go away. Or we could walk away completely, cut all ties, even if it shattered me. Or we could do the unthinkable, be together and risk everything. I sat awake that night staring at the ceiling, my baby sleeping soundly in the cot beside me. My mind kept replaying the conversation with Kendrick, his words, my words. The weight of it all was unbearable. He felt it too. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. If anything, it made me feel worse. Worse because now I knew that I wasn't crazy. It wasn't just me, but knowing that didn't make it any easier. I thought of my daughter, the little person who needed me more than anyone. She didn't ask for this mess. She didn't deserve to be dragged into my mess. I couldn't go on like this. The next morning, Kendrick was in the kitchen when I walked in. He looked up and for a second we just stared at each other. I broke the silence first. "I can't." He put down his coffee cup. "Can't what?" "This," my voice cracked. "I can't keep pretending it's not there, but I can't let it ruin everything either." He didn't speak right away, and I hated the look on his face, pain mixed with something else. Acceptance, maybe. "I understand," he said finally. I felt my chest tighten. "Do you?" He nodded. "You're right. Your baby comes first." I swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. "And you need someone who isn't this." He didn't argue. He just stepped closer, resting his hand lightly on my arm. "I'm still here, Brooklyn. I'm not going anywhere." His words were meant to make me feel better, but they only made it harder. I stepped back, creating space between us, even though it hurt. "I need time to find myself, to find out what this is." He didn't fight it. He just nodded, his jaw clenched. For the next few weeks, we kept things superficial. He still helped with the baby, still looked after me. But the touches stopped. The lingering looks faded. We pretended nothing had happened. But some nights after the baby was asleep, I'd lie in bed and wonder if it was really over, or just paused. Because the truth was, Kendrick wasn't just in my past, he was still in my present, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready to let him go completely. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you or made you feel anything, please take a moment to like this video. It will help more than you know. And if you think someone else needs to hear it, share it. Sometimes stories like this can be the push someone needs to start healing. And don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories like this, real, raw, and honest, and I'd love you to be there for the next one.